you very much for coming today to our first guest speaker for the Parapsychology Society. This is Callum Cooper from Northampton University, who's come to give us a lecture on telephone calls from the dead, but also possibly other interests that he's involved in. So I'll just read you a very quick bio to make sure I don't get it wrong about Callum. Now, he holds degrees in psychology and social science research methods. He's a PhD candidate at Northampton University within their Centre for the Study of Anomalous Psychological Processes. For his PhD, he's researching post-death experiences during bereavement and what cognitive mechanisms are promoted to aid recovery. He also lectures in parapsychology, sexual behaviour and thanatology.
Thanatology?
So, yeah, I wasn't sure how to pronounce that. Sorry about that. He is a member of the Society of Psychical Research and Parapsychological Association. He has had over 20 research articles published and received numerous grants and awards, including the Eileen Garrett Scholarship, the Alex Tanous Scholarship Award and the Gertrude Schmelder Award. He is author of Telephone Calls from the Dead and contributor editor to Conversations with Ghosts with Dr Alex Tanous and co-editor of Paracoustics with Steve Parsons. More widely, his interests include the psychology of death and bereavement, human beliefs and ancient mysticism. Okay, so I'll hand you over to Callum. Okay, thanks very much.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's really great to see how much parapsychology is integrating throughout the universities. And I was speaking to Ken recently about Northumbria University as well, have a second year module in parapsychology. And this has been going on for about a year or so. So it's great to see that more and more universities are actually finally showing awareness for this and kind of moving away from the internet and what people that are paid to actually post this pseudo-skeptical opinion and egregious information about parapsychologists. People are moving away to the actual research papers, the facts, what people are doing in the science, how long it's been going for, and just the kind of true importance of parapsychology as well. At Northampton, we embrace this kind of multidisciplinary approach as well. Within the Centre for the Study of Anomalous Psychological Processes, we have parapsychologists, transpersonal psychologists, and consciousness researchers as well, all with their own specialist interests outside of those fields as well. So we bring in so many different people. For example, we've got Dr Elizabeth Roxburgh and Rachel Evenden. They're both qualified counselling psychologists and parapsychologists. So they're involved heavily in clinical parapsychology, where people that have disturbing anomalous experiences seek counselling from specifically a parapsychologist who's trained as a counsellor. So the counsellor will understand the experiences you're going through, they understand the research behind it, they know it's a common experience and can tell the person involved in the counselling session this, and make them feel so much better that they're not the only one, they're not deluded, it's not some form of psychosis that's causing the experience. It could be a genuine event, there could have been multiple witnesses there as well. So it's really helpful when we actually bring in this counselling aspect with parapsychological knowledge. Transpersonal psychology, are you all familiar with this? It's basically people interested looking at spiritual peak experiences, religious experiences, so linking into religious practices of meditation, yoga and so forth. One of our latest PhD candidates, Chitak Nanjir, who's come from India, he's looking at the combination of yoga and parapsychology and what research within parapsychology has been done on yoga and its parapsychological aspects. One of our researchers as well, Dr Reverend Alistair Gordon Finsleydale, he's a Buddhist monk, but is also heavily involved in transpersonal psychology. So again, such a multidisciplinary approach. Our research team's about 15 people strong, ranging from staff members through to PhD candidates, master's students, and also undergraduate students doing research assistant roles as well. So we have a wide variety of research going on, from what I'm doing mainly looking at death and survival of death, to lucid dreaming, mediumship, the clinical parapsychology counselling aspect, the yoga that I mentioned, paganism and spell casting and healing, so a version of psychic healing, and is this actually doing something or is it the placebo effect, what's going on there, and so much more really, spirituality and well-being, so that has links into CSAPP as well. So big research department, so I'm told the biggest in the world at the moment. Originally it was the University of Edinburgh with the Co-Esler unit, but in 2004 Professor Bob Morris, who was the chair of the Co-Esler unit, he passed away. And so our research unit took over because we had Professor Deborah Delanoy, who'd done a PhD at Co-Esler as a parapsychologist, and we also had Dr Richard Broughton and several other people who come out of Edinburgh with PhDs in parapsychology, so our research department became the strongest. And now I feel really weird because I'm like only one of three of the original people there, still from like 2006, but it started in 1998. So yeah, that's a bit about our department. We have a third year module in parapsychology, and people seem to come to the University of Northampton to take on master's degrees, so if you can do dissertations in parapsychology. We have a heavy amount of people coming in to do PhDs in parapsychology, but we have so much interest for it, we just don't have the capacity, so we have to really limit how many PhDs are actually coming in as well. So I've been kicked up the arse more or less to get mine finished, and so is David Saunders, so we can then help supervise this new lot coming in. All kinds of great ideas are coming in then, and it's not just the stereotype that a lot of people think that someone just wants to test psychic abilities or they want to do haunting investigations. They've gone so much deeper and integrated so well within psychology and looking at, well, how does this issue of parapsychology link to modern world issues? So an example with my PhD, I've always been interested in the prospect of survival of death for consciousness, and so I was looking at these bereavement experiences, so people might sense the presence of the dead after they passed away, you might see an apparition of them, you might dream about them and so forth, and even the telephone calls as well might come into it. So there's a link for you, but I thought, well, what are these actually doing? So many people, even in their own doctorates, about 14 different doctorates that have looked at it in different aspects, have said these experiences are very therapeutic. But why are they therapeutic? No one actually thought to ask why they're therapeutic beyond that. And is it purely psychological, or is there some objective aspect to it? Do we have some sort of validity that can say, there were multiple witnesses, there's information here that the person shouldn't have actually gained access to via the normal senses? And so I'm interested in that aspect, but it branches onto positive psychology because people said these experiences give people hope. So I'm looking at the psychology of hope. Can I measure that within a group of people that have had these experiences against people that have never had a post-death experience during bereavement? And I've found that there are significant differences between the two, and it seems we are actually measuring hope being present rather than casually finding it within the qualitative data. But I've had to work through this sort of filtration of saying, here's the quantitative data, now we're going down to look at all the cases and what happened, now we're going to go down to interview and find out what's happening there by asking people what their experiences were like, how it changed them if it did at all, and what hope actually means to them. So there I think I've got a combination of parapsychology, thanatology, looking at death, dying and bereavement, positive psychology, well-being, and then it integrates into the counselling side of things, clinical parapsychology. So it's not just one topic, it's so many combined. But telephone calls from the dead, let me take you on a journey through this, how I got into this, what it's all about, and what the researchers had to say. Well, an anomalous telephonic communication, it can be described as any communication found to be irregular by the maker or receiver of the call which appears to defy rational explanation. So one of those could be a telephone conversation with someone known to be dead, a telephone conversation with an entity presumed to be extraterrestrial in origin, or a call carried out by someone who was proved to be nowhere near a telephone at the time the alleged call was made or received. So the most common one we know about is category A, but these ones seem to crop up within whatever data we collect. And there's a massive amount of history to all this. So I've put this up to just give you a brief overview and describe how these things are different. So I'm specifically talking about these anomalous telephone calls experiences. And hopefully you're familiar with the term EVP, electronic voice phenomena, this alleged recording of bangs, raps, taps, scratches and possible voices of the dead. These are sought experiences. You're making a recording, or a recording is taking place. Upon playback, you find something. So there is the intention to record something. With the telephone calls, it's a spontaneous experience. No one expects to have a telephone call from the dead. There's no expectancy or suggestion involved in it. Certainly it's never been demonstrated within any of the cases that that was the case. So much like parapsychological phenomena in numerous aspects, you can split it into sought or spontaneous phenomena. Apparitions, ghosts, hauntings, poltergeist activity, a vision of the future, that's spontaneous. Going to see a medium, that's sought. You've actively gone to do it. Or some form of therapy. So let me give you a history here. Well, the furthest I could trace back at the time I started doing this research, the telephone phenomenon, was a guy called David Wilson. He was a solicitor living in London, and he was an amateur wireless telegraph operator. And as I say, interested in spiritualism. I believe he was involved with the College of Psychic Studies, which is in London, directly opposite the Natural History Museum. National History. And he published a paper in there in 1915 describing his experiments with the wireless telegraph machine. He believed he was getting anomalous communication via the Morse code, even when he removed the receiving aerial. So when you remove that, really you shouldn't be able to actually have any incoming information, but still he was getting it. He developed the machine further, changed the clicks to a galvanometer, so it was producing audible beeps, so you'd have the beep, 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 beep. And he'd be transcribing the code, getting messages that would say, wait 7 days, 6 hours. He'd wait 7 days, 6 hours, nothing had actually happened. So we brought someone else in to actually try and transcribe the Morse code with him as well. They were getting the same messages, and he was just absolutely confused as to where they were coming from. He thought maybe it could be structural vibrations within the building. Lorry drives by, even though this is the early 1900s, but maybe something is causing the building structurally to upset the machine, and it's causing these false beeps, yet they're still getting some sort of sensical message out of it. He also believed that maybe extraterrestrials were influencing the device, and that's what was causing the code. Even so, he never really figured out what was going on or what sort of where the information was coming from. That's the only paper I could ever find from David Wilson, but it was an early one. Before that, though, I have actually found one earlier. I do need to update this and put it in. There was one at least from 1889, and I'll tell you the story now, even though I might waffle on, but in 1889, you can imagine there weren't that many telephones about, and there was this particular family who had a telephone to their factory. Let me get this right. There's a factory, and there was an office. I'm going to waffle on too much if I try and figure this out. I'll come back to it at the end. If you really want to know, ask me the question about that case, and I'll come back to it. Otherwise, it'll take too long in my head to try and piece it back together. It wasn't necessarily a call from the dead. It was more so no one was at the telephone at the time to have taken it. I'll explain some better cases to you instead of that one. Francis Grierson, he was a literary figure in California. He wrote numerous books, fictional books, but his very last book that he published was self-published, called Psychophone Messages. Anyone here familiar with the idea of a psychophone, or psychophones and what they are? Are you familiar with the idea of going to sleep listening to inspirational speech, so the unconscious mind takes it in? Well, psychophones were essentially this. You could buy them for that very thing. And you could buy records to play depending on what it was you needed help with in your waking life. And the records were not in the sense of a disc. They were like the same size as a loo roll holder, the cardboard tube, and there'd be a wax cylinder where the needle, as it spun, would just gradually work its way down. And the speaker would be no bigger than this. You'd leave it by the side of the bed, you wind it up, you let it play the speech as you sleep. If you put it on reverse with a blank wax cylinder, you could speak into the funnel and record speech onto it, so like a very early dictaphone. Somehow Francis Grierson adapted this device to take it into seances with fellow experimenters and record voices of the dead during seances. In his book, it's not that clear how he's adapted this device to do so. There's a few sentences here and there scattered that suggest what he was doing, but nothing concrete, and it's really hard to get hold of these devices as well. I always question whether it was a gimmick being his last book that he brought this out. Though he was involved in spiritualism quite heavily, Francis Grierson went under the name of Jesse Shepherd throughout Europe, practicing as a medium himself. And the book is remarkable. The people that they got in touch with through spirit were people like General U.S. Grant, Abraham Lincoln, Benjamin Franklin, all giving interesting, inspirational speech and some predictions about the future, including World War II. You can get hold of this book now because they photocopied all the pages, so Amazon do an instant print of it for you if you're interested in reading about this book. F.R. Melton, he was from my neck of the woods in Nottingham, amateur inventor and psychical researcher, and he published a paper in 1921 in Light. That's also the place where David Wilson's paper was published. Light is the journal of the College of Psychic Studies, still going to this day, started in 1881. And Melton developed this device. He showed some pictures of it in the first article that he did. And it was a telephone to essentially contact the dead. And it contained a glass tube in it, like a test tube, to capture ectoplasm, in the traditional sense of ectoplasm. We all think of it because of how it's been put into the movies and so forth, as a slime. We know from the literature it was more like a smoke and ash substance. When something did materialise in a seance from ectoplasm, it would appear like ash, and it would be so delicate to the touch it would just dissolve if you were to touch it. So he was capturing this within the test tube, which would allow the telephone to work if he contained ectoplasmic spiritual mist. Beyond this, though, he wanted to develop the telephone even further, so he could take it to people, get them to have a go and say, well, this isn't me just suggesting it's working. I want you to have a go and get in contact with your relatives. Tell me what you think. So he wanted to develop it further, asked his oldest son. His oldest son wasn't interested. His oldest son was a telephone and radio expert in the war, and he'd been given permanent sick leave because he'd been injured in some conflict, and so he was working in Nottingham at the army schools, teaching new recruits how to mend telephones and radios. He'd frequently go to an electrical shop in town to meet a girl who would supply him with all the devices that he needed to take to the school, and both of them fell in love, and it was hoped that they'd get married. They were engaged, and the family adored her. Soon, though, a short illness took her, and she passed away. One evening, Melton, his youngest son, his wife, and a friend who was staying for Easter were conducting a séance within the dining room. The oldest son came in, saw what they were doing, poo-pooed the whole situation as he'd done many times before, especially when discussions of psychical research came up. And his youngest brother said, shh, we're getting a message from Jay. And there was another initial involved, which I can't remember. But all of a sudden, he started to become interested, hearing all these bangs, raps and taps about the room. So he came and sat down. The bangs and raps that he was hearing weren't your usual just thud. They were Morse code messages coming through the table. And there was a description as it sounded like it was just above the table rather than beneath, in case it was anyone's knees or so forth doing it. And the messages he was hearing were specific to Jay. They had a code that they used, because this was like early text messaging for them, with them both being skilled with Morse code. Whenever he wasn't at the electric shop, he'd still speak to her via the wireless telegraph, and they'd have an instant message they'd send to know it was each other starting the conversation. And that's what happened in the seance room. The first message that came through was this specific message relevant to him knowing to start a conversation with Jay. And so he became more intrigued, and finally he agreed to help his father make a new device that could contact the dead. But he couldn't be with his father all the time. He was busy, he was working at these army schools, so they decided to develop it in some way that would mean that it would work via what Melton Sr. thought was causing it to work. I'll get to this in a minute, it's really quite interesting. And so his son could still go to the army schools, but his father could take this device and it has a special component in it. But that's later down the line. And he published a further paper and a book called Psychic Telephone, which outlined the exact mechanics of this device, what it involved, and that you could build it yourself as well. Have a go. This is what it involves, and several psychical researchers did. So that was some of the early stuff. Raymond Bayliss was the very first parapsychologist. He's termed a parapsychologist. He's more so a sort of psychical researcher in the traditional sense. Psychical researchers were scholars that were well read in psychical research literature and went out and did field investigations of seances and haunted properties. Parapsychologists usually had some sort of formal educated background in some field or discipline, and they've gone on to receive PhDs. Not all the time though, but he's often referred to as a parapsychologist. He was actually a landscape painter by trade and had produced many fantastic paintings for government halls and fictional books. But he was fascinated in psychical research. He was a research coordinator for the Southern Californian Society for Psychical Research, and was the sort of master and apprentice to D. Scott Rogo, who we'll talk about in a minute. So in 1959, he'd been conducting EVP experiments, setting up a soundproof room in California in a flat that he rented, setting up these devices to record, hopefully, spirit voices of the dead with a medium called a Tillabonzile. These started in 1956. It wasn't until 1959 that he published as a correspondence in the Journal of the American Society for Psychical Research the results of this study. Not a single parapsychologist cared about it. No one responded to the correspondence, the editor didn't respond to it, it just went unnoticed. 3 months later, the former opera singer and Swedish filmmaker Fredrik Jürgensen published an announcement saying that he had discovered spirit voices on tape while recording bird songs. And there's a whole kind of mismatch of information as to whether the first voice came through was his alleged mother coming through or his father. The information's a bit vague, but he became so famous as the one to discover EVP. And if you read any popular books on the paranormal and EVP, it will mention him and not Raymond Bayliss. Raymond Beers was pretty annoyed by that for a number of years. Following that, people like the Latvian psychologist Dr Konstantin Raudva followed on, took this research further, wanted to understand the psychology behind it a bit more, but was convinced that these were genuine voices of the dead. He published a book in German on it that got translated into English and was a massive hit and was actually called Breakthrough, and came with a vinyl record where if you read the book you could listen to the record and listen to the voices yourself as you read through the research. And there were loads of parapsychologists that published various correspondence in the Journal of Parapsychology, Light, and the Journal of the Society of Psychical Research, and the American one as well, arguing over whether this was genuine, depending on what studies they'd done and other people's opinions. People didn't like EVP. Parapsychologists today still somewhat frown upon it, whether it's got anything genuinely to do with survival of death. There seems to be so much more psychology behind it, involving the pareidolia effect and hearing, making sense of voices within static, as we do visually as well. We can have the pareidolia effect when looking at clouds, and I can say that cloud over there behind that building looks like a bunny rabbit. You might all agree, but at the end of the day, it's a cloud, it's not a bunny rabbit. But I've made sense of it by what my brain has instantly seen. I've tried to actually form some sort of recognition out of a nonsensical shape. And this seems to happen with audio as well. When we can't quite hear the sound, our brain still tries to give the best match to it. So you're hearing all that, did you hear the name Chris? And then group conformity might take over. So many explanations. David Ellis took this forward. He was the Perrott Warwick Student Scholar for 2 years through Trinity College, Cambridge. The SPR, the Society for Psychical Research, which started parapsychology in 1882, they still give out this Trinity scholarship now, and my supervisor, Professor Chris Rome, he's now the senior researcher for this. This means that for 3 years, he's doing full-time research on parapsychology, which could extend to 5. David got 2 as the student at the time and wanted to actually look into this further. And he was probably one of the first people to recognise, without necessarily saying pareidolia, he recognised this whole ability to make sense of a sound that doesn't seem to make sense, it's just static. Especially when he was playing tapes of pure static and people still made sense of it. So that was EVP sandwiched in between. Well, telephone calls kind of cropped up in between. There was Voices from Beyond by Telephone, that's the translated title, written by Oscar de Argonal, and also a medium believed that through the telephone they could get in contact with the dead whenever they liked, and somehow the dead were manipulating the electrons within the line to produce recognisable speech and voice characteristics as well. I've never read the book because I can only read English. I really struggle. I envy some of my colleagues that can speak at least 3 different languages, so they've got access to all the parapsychology journals. But then Scott Rogo started getting involved with these studies with Raymond Bayliss later down the line from the age of 16, publishing his first report in the Journal of Paraphysics in 1968. And that discussed some of the further von Zalay studies and became Bayliss's apprentice. Bayliss taught him more about psychical research, and Scott Rogo was fascinated with parapsychology. His background was in music, that was his first degree, but he became a skilled parapsychologist and even taught on a master's course at John F. Kennedy University just purely on parapsychology. So even with just an undergraduate degree, people took him on as a known authority. And they were doing so much of these studies, people eventually came forward and said, oh, you're recording voices of the dead, that's interesting. I had a case where I think I had a telephone call from someone that died. They hadn't heard many of these cases, so they just dismissed them at the start. They'd heard 1 or 2. And then more and more people started coming forward, so they thought, well, maybe something's in this. We've got to actually start maybe going through the parapsychology journal, seeing how many of these accounts seem to crop up in the books and journals, how many people to this day know about it, how many psychologists and parapsychologists know about it. And so they did a 2-year-long investigation from 1977 to 1979, and I'll come back to that. A follow-up study was done by Dr. Massimo Biondi in Italy, medical doctor and parapsychologist over there. And then I started to really write about it in 2010, but my interest started around about 2008. This is going back to Melton. This is his device. It's the only extract I can find from that pamphlet, Psychic Telephone, because I cannot find that pamphlet anywhere. But Scott Rogo published about this in Phone Calls from the Dead, their book in 1979. And this is what it involves. We've got some simple components here: transmitter, tension spring, receivers, dry cell battery, and so forth. But look at this, a balloon. A balloon is inside this wooden box containing the apparatus. What do you reckon's inside the balloon? What kind of air?
Hydrogen, something.
No. Any other guesses?
Helium.
Someone said that the other week. Nope. No. Could make it sound fun if you
Pure
slowly
oxygen.
pumped helium into the room. Yeah.
Pure oxygen.
You're getting closer. It was Melton Senior, the oldest son who dismissed it all, didn't really agree with spiritualism. It was his breath. Melton had noticed that even though his son dismissed the whole seance, when he came in, got involved, was actually interested, the activity in the seance room heightened, and he was having a full Morse code conversation with allegedly his deceased fiancée. And so he believed that his son was an unrecognised medium, knew that he couldn't attend spiritualist churches with him to actually demonstrate this device, so said, well, we'll still develop the device that has a psychic component. So we'll have the psychic ether, we'll have your breath inside the balloon. And so that's what happened. Melton Senior's breath was inside the balloon. It was taken to various spiritualist churches. People came up and put their headphones on and believed they were actually receiving voices of their deceased loved ones. He changed this in the 1930s to have a full speaker on the box, so it wasn't just a one-to-one thing. Everyone in the audience could hear what was going on. The psychical researcher Heward Carrington in the United States copied the device with the exact things involved here. Said that he couldn't get any of it to work, it didn't work whatsoever. The ghost hunter Harry Price of the 1930s, he decided to make a replication of it as well, and the letters, the correspondence between Melton is still in Senate House Library at the University of London. And he said to Melton, I can't get it to work. I've even brought a medium in to actually sit with me as I make the device work, and it still doesn't seem to produce voice of the dead. Scott Rogo's later argument was it's like that whole replication thing. Just because you've replicated the device doesn't mean to say it's necessarily the exact same as the original device. So you need to go back to the original device and conduct experiments on that, rather than the replications that you've made that just seem to not quite fit the bill of the original one. Plus, they're not going to be able to match the balloon that Melton's used, if indeed it was working. But like many of these devices, we don't know where this device is. I wish I did. And there's been many psychic devices come and go that I really don't know where they are. I've only ever worked on one of them to find out what it was doing. And it's such a shame because this is where it starts and stops. People say they were getting in contact with the dead. That's as far as our conclusions can go. We can say maybe it was group suggestion, but if one-to-one people were going up and they were adamant, or there was a speaker on the lid, again, we can place some conventional explanations, we can place some parapsychological explanations, but it stops there. We can't say it was a load of nonsense. We haven't got any more information to go on, which is a big, big shame. Thomas and Edison, though, seem to jump on the bandwagon. I'm sure many of you are familiar with him, big inventor of the United States, and he gave an interview to Scientific American in 1920 talking about life after death and his own ideas to create a device. His own parents were spiritualists, so he'd been raised in a spiritual family, and he would only ever hire Polish-American psychics as lab assistants. There were frequently Polish-American psychics, so after a day's work in the lab, they would gather around and hold a seance, extracurricular activity. During this interview where he said he was going to create a device that would have such delicate components that if indeed the dead do survive, it would give them a chance to get in contact. He said this: if our personality survives, then it is strictly logical and scientific to assume that it retains memory, intellect, and other faculties and knowledge that we acquire on this earth. Therefore, if personality exists after what we call death, it's reasonable to conclude that those who leave this earth would like to communicate with those they have left behind. 1920 he gave this interview. He died 11 years later. No device came to the surface. However, the Thomas Edison Museum in Texas, one of the main correspondents they get almost every month, telephone, email and letters, are people asking to see pictures of the device or the blueprints. There aren't any blueprints. There's been some hoaxes that have cropped up. There isn't a device either. Again, there's been some hoaxes. There was no evidence from the remains of his property suggesting he even began to build one of these things. I believe it was genuine in him wanting to jump on the bandwagon. If several researchers have published papers saying they've made a device and it worked, that's a big invention that can earn you a lot of money if indeed it does work. So Edison would definitely want some of that, but it seems that he never actually got round to actually starting it. And he will probably have faced a lot of controversy had he ever made attempts and came forward saying it was working. It's one of those double-edged swords. So these are my inspiration. D. Scott Rogo, Douglas Scott Rogo, always known as Scott Rogo, and Raymond Bayliss. And Scott was the apprentice to Raymond. They've both written on numerous things which I come to. Scott passed away in 1990. He was stabbed to death at his home in California. Not related to his interest in the paranormal, but an interesting story nonetheless as to how that happened. But he died at the age of 40, as you can see, gained such a reputation in parapsychology. He published his first book on parapsychology, on spontaneous music and noise appearing in the ether, which many people had reported on, during his time as an undergraduate. And then ended up publishing 30 books in total, over 100 research papers, and had been teaching on university master's degree programs for parapsychology. Was also a research associate for the Maimonides Medical Center and the North Carolina Psychical Research Foundation, many others. He did himself a big reputation as an authority and was not a guy to argue with when it came to parapsychology. Whenever it came to someone dismissing his book or his research, he would put something in the correspondence to the journal. If someone replied, he would respond again, and he would keep doing it until you stopped sending letters to the editor. Oh, sorry, I've skipped Raymond Bayliss. He passed away in 2004. And stopped really writing any books around about 1981, but was still heavily involved in psychical research. Mainly, he spent a lot of his time going back to paintings again. So this is their book. This is the only kind of joint thing they ever worked on. And this is one of the three formats it came out in. And I love this as well, the sort of 1970s, 80s paperback design books with this cross going into the grave and the telephone lines going straight through it, as though you've got this direct contact with the dead. There's some more brilliant ones here when, I'll show you the other books in a second. There's some media fame. When they wrote this book, it drew a lot of attention. People loved the title Phone Calls from the Dead. No one had published a book like this before, discussing actual accounts. This is the only picture I've ever seen, and it came from the National Enquirer, of them together, allegedly taking an account and writing it down and going out to investigate it. So let me show you an extract, hopefully if it works, of what Scott Rogo was like and him discussing the calls and the research. And here's a bit of Leonard Nimoy for you as well.
Could spirits actually be attempting to speak to us? One man may have uncovered evidence that implies spirit communication may occur with remarkable frequency. D. Scott Rogo is the author of Phone Calls from the Dead.
Well, I first heard about these cases when I first entered the field, which was close to 10, 12 years ago. And I really didn't take them seriously at all. I thought they were very outlandish. It was hard for me to believe that people were actually getting phone calls from people who were dead. But as the years progressed and I did more and more investigations, I discovered that these calls were fairly common. And then I realized that there was a major effect here that someone really had to study.
Mary Meredith of Oklahoma City recreates the night she purportedly received a phone call from the dead.
Hello? Of course, I don't tell everybody about it because a lot of people still think that I'm crazy when they even hear about it. But I know that it was, and it happened to me.
Mary Meredith's case occurred in 1977. She had just been in the hospital. She had returned to her home not knowing that there was a letter waiting for her telling her that her cousin had died. She had been very close to this cousin. It was very soon after she read this letter from her mother that the phone rang, and it was from her cousin.
It just really upset me when I got the phone call, and I hung up on the first phone call because it upset me. But when she called back again, I said, I cannot believe that anyone would call someone and tell them that it's their cousin when my cousin is dead. I can't believe this. I said, and I have been sick, and I can't believe anyone would pull something on me like this. She said, but I know you've been sick. I was at the hospital with you. And I said, what are you talking about? And the phone started getting crackling, and then I couldn't hear her. No, it just faded away.
The idea that the dead can contact the living through electromagnetic devices is certainly not new with my research. Thomas Edison, for instance, several years before his death, became very fascinated with the idea that he could invent a machine that could bring through the voices of the dead, and even apparently made some sketches of such equipment. Edison, as is well known, was extremely paranoid about his ideas and kept them very, very hidden, so he never patented his ideas. But certain sketches did surface after his death, which purported to be the machine he was working on.
Leave that there, just so you got an idea. Okay, so Scott Rogo didn't even believe in them when he first started hearing about them, but noted how common they were. So that's why they decided to do an investigation to run a full analysis using social science research methods to find out what was going on. And these are the kind of books that they published on. Raymond Bayliss was a sort of traditional scholar of psychical research and was very much interested in survival or death, as you can see from the titles of his books. Scott published on a whole host of things, even incorporating ufology and the fact that sometimes when we see UFOs, we can liken them to apparitions, and the whole sense of the way that we actually perceive the UFO or the apparition might be created by the same psychological processes. He was also looking at religious experiences, miracles, weeping statues, apparitions of the Virgin Mary and so forth, like the Marian apparitions at Zeitnan in Cairo, if any of you have heard about those. This one I love the most, and it's now, this was the rarest after I published Telephone Calls from the Dead, which is an updated study, as I'll discuss. This became really rare. Now this has become really rare, ESP and Your Pet. And I love it, this guy's looking at a Zena card and he's trying to get the cat to guess it, and the cat's put its paw on the star and got it right. But again, this shows the 1970s, 80s paperback books, and I think they were brilliant designs, even though they're sort of a weird tacky, because you can't quite tell, is it a photo, is it a sketch? They look half and half. But I think there's only 2 copies of that now on Amazon. It's £999.99, and it's a tiny little paperback. And I was so obsessed at the time when I became a big fan of Rogo and Bayliss that I've got 2 copies of that in my library and 3 of this, all in different formats. They're staying there. Okay, I don't know why I tapped that. I've got this. So additional books. What happened after that? I was trying to look for other research that they got involved with. I'd seen that whole study. I'd read the book through and through, and I made numerous notes. Where did they take it? What happened after that? Did they actually publish a research paper on it beyond the book? Well, I found in Scott's book, Life After Death, there is a whole chapter in there on telephone calls from the dead. And in the last book Raymond Bayliss did with Dr. Elizabeth McAdams, who's now the president of the International Foundation for Survival Research. She was the president of the Southern Californian SPR. They have a chapter in there on phone calls from the dead, only 3 pages long. Didn't really show me anything new, just some new ideas, but no research published. So what was actually done? Well, we have the book. 50 cases were analysed, 4 types of phone call events were discovered through a content analysis. And with Biondi, further content analysis was carried out on similar cases using a smaller Italian sample, and found that his case types fit theirs. So I'll come to what those case types are in a minute. And what was the outcome of these studies? Well, Dr. Gertrude Schmeidler, who was a parapsychologist at New York City University, she was interested in the book. She said it is scientific by the very methods that they've used. These scholars are well known to parapsychology, so we can also take them as well accredited people, but they need to present this research at conference. The abstract needs to be peer reviewed, or they need to publish a paper to demonstrate this as a sort of unusual parapsychological scientific anomaly. Numerous book reviews came out as well, and there were some that were really bad, some in the fact that they either got the information wrong or just hated what they were doing. Julia Hardy, who published in the Parapsychology Review, she hated it. She said it wasn't scientific at all, it was popular tripe, it's nonsense. And Cox, who published the review in Theta, which was the journal of the Psychical Research Foundation in North Carolina, he completely got it wrong, because he thought that 100 accounts had been analysed, 50 had been analysed. Julia Hardy commented that they haven't actually stated how many people that they've looked at, how many cases. So in both instances they've got it wrong. And I will admit, when you read Phone Calls from the Dead, it is extremely difficult to find any data in there, because there's no appendices to actually tell you what page it's on. I've got one copy that is just literally covered in sticky notes and pencil marks all the way through, where I've highlighted specific statistics all over the place that I had to extract. So that's where I then took over and thought, well, 2010, we've got all these previous things. What's happening now? We've got mobile phones, we've got emails, these are even baby monitors, we're using walkie-talkies more, voicemail messages and so forth. I got their book, and so many others, and wasn't interested in reading it until during the time, 2008 or so, I saw a newspaper article, California, where a kind of commuter train and a freight train collided. and it made massive headline news because a guy who was involved in it, Charles Peck, who was a passenger, he'd allegedly called his family from beyond the grave, and his family were aware of what happened. They knew he was coming home on this train. It made big news. Everyone was watching it live on TV, the rescue, and their mobile phone was constantly ringing saying that it was him to his son, his daughter, his wife, and when they picked up it was just static. When they called back it just went to, the person cannot take your call at the moment, so thinking either it's switched off or it's dead, the battery's dying. So whenever he rang them, they would just answer and yell words of encouragement down the phone. Don't worry, Dad, the rescuers are coming now, just hang on, thinking that maybe he's trapped and is just managing to press the phone over and over again, and it's calling the last people in the call register. The call stopped around about 3:30 a.m, and the rescuers found his body shortly after that. Apparently he died on first impact. He was one of the sort of closest seats to the front of the train, so it was absolutely smashed up, and no one ever recovered the mobile phone. Now, conventional explanations tell me that somehow the phone's been thrown, and if indeed it was still working, it's got jammed somewhere and it's calling the last few people in the phone register over and over again just because it's jammed against something. I can only assume so. This is slightly before iPhones, so we'd have buttons that can be pressed, so if you wedge them against something it's easier to make a false call. I've done that numerous times when I'd have my mobile in my pocket and I'd leant against the sink or something, I'd call 999 just because my leg has been jamming it against the sink when I'm leaning looking in the mirror. So a possibility, but the media nevertheless had said this is a phone call from the dead, and that went out to so many people. So I thought, well, what is the reality of this? How many people are still reporting phone calls from the dead? And what other research can I find? Can I actually do a better job than Rogo and Bayliss in the follow-up after their own book? So this all happened, I followed it through, I went back to the original research, which I'll describe to you now, but I also met the demands of Gertrude Schmeidler. After this book was published in 2012, I sent it out for review in various journals, gathered all the book reviews back, and I was pleased to say I got completely good reviews for the book, and just 2 of them said it would be nice to see a clearer outline of the methods and appendices, and it was more or less what Gertrude Schmeidler had said, peer-reviewed publication. So last year, I made sure that in the Journal of Parapsychology, an analysis for exceptional experiences involving telecommunication technology, the original wishes of Dr. Gertrude Schmeidler were granted, and it ended up peer-reviewed in the Journal of Parapsychology. So now there is an official paper on this research beyond the books. So what happened? There were different types, different categories that I mentioned. Well, the first type of call that they found in this content analysis, if any of you have done one before, you might have loads of written accounts, sometimes interviews, and it's literally a case of sitting on a living room floor, getting it all free, spreading it out, reading them through over and over again, getting familiar with the cases, and starting to recognise categories and putting them in. And this is what I had to do, and this is what they did. So their first call type was called simple calls, the most popular. Limited conversation. So you might know the person to be dead, you're recently bereaved, telephone rings, you go to answer it, they might say your name, a few words or so forth, and then all you hear is static, just like the woman reported in her case with Scott Rogo, just hearing static on the line and strange winds. You never hear the phone go down, never a click or an audible beep, their voice just seems to fade out. Type 2, prolonged calls. Someone calls you, let's say Mary calls you, and you have a long conversation with Mary, half an hour or so, and she says some things that are quite unusual, relevant to things you both know about, but a finality to them, or handing them over to you in a way, something like that. Or I'm going away soon, something like that. It seems to be very typical. Following the call, Joe turns up at the door. Joe looks really upset. What's wrong, Joe? Oh, did you hear about Mary? Well, I've just been speaking to Mary. Joe looks absolutely confused, glances over what you just said. Well, Mary died in a car crash yesterday. So because you didn't know the person was dead, the call still takes place. You have prolonged conversation with them, and somehow not knowing them to be dead seems to prolong it. In some of the type 1 calls, they noted that if you recognise for some reason, like in a type 2 halfway through, that this person had died, then it ended the call. Not again with phone going down, their voice faded out almost instantly, but there was no audible click as though it was a prank call taking place and someone just quickly slammed the phone down. But that's what type 2 calls were like. Type 3, answer calls. This is where you go to make the call, and 2 different types of things could happen. One could be like a type 2 call. You go to ring this person, they answer, you didn't know they were dead, you still had the conversation, and afterwards you find out they were long dead by the time it took place. Or you go and make a call to someone, they still answer, And later on, when you speak to them about it, they have no knowledge of it. It turns out they were nowhere near a telephone, or say a landline telephone at that time, the one that you called, to have taken that call. One example that was given during the time Rogo and Bayliss were studying this, as happens when you're studying any particular phenomenon, you start to take note of it more. They recognised themselves having these cases themselves. So Raymond Bayliss called Scott one weekend, Scott wasn't in, and his flatmate answered. And said, "Oh, sorry, Scott's gone away, he'll be back tomorrow." And Raymond Bayliss said, "Well, could you take a note, tell him it's me." Raymond Bayliss knew this flatmate and said, "Please get Scott to call me back straight away." I said, "No problem." 4 days go by, Raymond Bayliss has said nothing. He calls Scott again, Scott answers, and he says, "Did you not get my message?" "Well, what message?" "I left it with your flatmate on the weekend. You were to call me back." Apparently the flatmate had gone away, he was several states away, the flat was completely empty over the weekend. So who answered the phone with the flatmate's voice, characteristics and so forth? Who answered it? But this is what seemed to happen. It still took place. Mixed calls. I found this in my own analysis because I managed to find just an extra case that split up. I still found similar categories, but I certainly gave an argument for there being mixed calls, which could be any of these three, but more so type 1 or type 2. So you can know someone to be dead, but still have repeated, prolonged conversations with that person. And it happens in a few cases, so that's what mixed were. And intention calls, I think, are the most remarkable. This is where you intend to call someone, but at the last minute, you change your mind. And still, that call takes place for someone. I just want to find you an extract of one, so I can show you what they're like. Scott Rogo had one, and then several other people. This is kind of like when you think about chaos theory, or the butterfly effect, and so forth as well. Also the butterfly effect, I don't know why I mentioned chaos. But butterfly, so making those different decisions, a yes or no answer, and what would the side of me have done that chose no? What would happen to me now if I'd gone down that route? And these events seem to kind of show that there's evidence for this, that there are multiple versions of us depending on what decisions that we make. They also seem to support the case for apparitions of the living. People report more apparitions of living people than they do dead people. And it seems to be people going to places they would have gone to, or typical places they go to, as though somehow that path is still playing out briefly, and you've got to witness that person there, or somehow the building has recorded them being there. So to stick to intention calls, here's an example. It was 4 o'clock on a bright Thursday afternoon, and I was lying on my living room couch thinking about making a call to a psychologist I knew at the UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute. Although I intended to make the call, I never did. About 6 that evening, though, I got the shock of my life when a call came in from the institute and from the office of the very psychologist I had thought about calling. The call was from a research assistant saying he was answering my message. When I asked what in blazes he was talking about, he told me that at 4 p.m. a call had come into them from me, and the caller had left my name and asked that the call be returned. So there was one example, and many more came up. This is my case for the type 4, so a mixture of those two. This was submitted to me by Dr Jones, not his real name, but he is a Doctor of Psychology and Sociology. He applied for the Co-Essler Chair at the University of Edinburgh when it came up, and he was working at the University of Bristol at the time. No, Bath. Yes, it was in Bath. That's it, University of Bath. And he said this happened round about the age of 11. His parents had split up, but they were still living in the same home quite amicably. This was the 1960s, and his father had found new love interests. His mother had gone back to her childhood sweetheart, and they'd re-met up and formed a relationship again. But due to financial situations, they couldn't actually get new lodgings at this time. But things were perfectly amicable, and very respectful of each other and what they were doing. The kids were the main focus, because Dr. Jones had another brother as well, and possibly a sister. Anyway, his mother's childhood sweetheart lived some distance away. He got work that involved him travelling a lot, so 3 to 4 times a week he would call. She'd get the kitchen telephone and take it into the downstairs bathroom and have at least a half-hour conversation with him. He got ill, he went into hospital, she made some visits, and then she got a call which her previous husband took, found out the guy had died. She was distraught, rang the hospital to check. They said, yes, we're so sorry. Several weeks later, as grieving's taking place, the telephone rings in the kitchen. She goes to answer it. She's away for half an hour. She comes back white as a sheet. Dr. Jones says, what's happened? And she says, Richard just rang. But what do? There's no Ghostbusters to ring. There's no fire, ambulance, police that are going to care about this. No one really knows about the Societies for Psychical Research at the time. They weren't popularised. So what do? They just lived with it. For the next 2 to 3 years, 3 to 4 times a week, she was having a half-hour conversation with someone that seems to be dead. At one time when she went out shopping, at the time he would normally call, Dr. Jones was in, the telephone rang, he picked it up and he heard the sound of static and wind on the line and just panicked, being an 11-year-old boy and knowing from the family living with it that this is a guy calling from beyond the grave. He instantly shouted, "She's not here," and slammed the phone down. How he regrets that now, wishing he'd actually stayed on the line to actually hear what she was hearing. But when he later on learned about the book Phone Calls from the Dead, he noted so many characteristics that were the same. So for several months, he and I were corresponding about this and discussing the analysis of phone calls from the dead and how it related to his case. And his mother passed away about 6 or 7 years ago, and he managed to get her 5-year diary from the time. This is dated, so it went through to the early 60s. This is dated 1958. But it says, "Sunday morning my darling phoned to say that he loved me and would always be at my side. He said he had come back with me, and now I must be happy. I had been good, and soon he would come again to talk with me. I asked him to help me sleep, and he said, 'Now you will sleep. Goodbye, my darling. I'll be back soon to talk with you.'" Page after page after page, it's like the same script over and over and over again, just words of comfort and so forth. There's no real deep conversation going on, but this lasts for half an hour or so, that their conversations on the phone, and then she'd go and write extracts of the conversation in the book. It's never figured out what happened. The phone calls faded away after 3 years. If it was fraudulent, which is one of the first things we must always consider in these cases, was there still something going on between her and her husband, and it was some sort of prank that was continued? That's a lot of commitment to do it for 3 years, 3 to 4 times a week. But it's still a possibility. We don't know. It's 50s, the 60s, all that evidence is gone, she's passed away, we can't check with the phone call companies. As it stands and what we've got left, we can just put it to the other cases and see how it fits in. But it seemed to produce this category of type 4. So this is what they look like from my recent analysis. And so type 1 calls outweigh type 2 calls by almost 3 to 1 in my study. In the original study they found they outweigh them by 4 to 1. Calls from the dead outweigh calls from the living by just over 7 to 1, so almost the same as theirs, 8 to 1. As you can see, the type 1 calls, where we are in a state of bereavement, they're the highest. Sometimes though there are multiple witnesses, but they notice some unusual anomalies taking place. There would be the sound of static and wind on the line, and also with these being old Bakelite telephones as well, you might have 3 in the house, 1 in the living room, 1 in the hallway, 1 upstairs. They noted that every time someone had a phone call from the dead, it would only be the telephone closest to them that would ring. And sometimes it would ring with a slightly less bell tone. It was 80 hammers beats per second or so that caused the Bakelite ring tone. People were reporting this to be reduced by almost half, suggesting that maybe something within them was causing the call to take place. Type 2, those prolonged ones less, I only found 1 case of this, which will eat up the time if I talk about it. Those mixed calls, I found a good amount of those that matched those intention calls. And then miscellaneous, I just couldn't place these other calls. And they're mixed in here really, I was going to tell you about those. So sometimes the dead will call giving you a warning, don't take that car journey tomorrow. And you take the dead's advice, you think that was a weird call, but they've also given you a message. You avoid taking that car journey, you take the train instead. Turns out on the very route you would have taken in the car, there's a major car crash. And you've averted certain death or being injured. Anniversary calls, they happen in 8% of cases, but by the law of statistics that's going to sort of happen anyway, I found, but people have found specific meanings to them. They've called on the anniversary of the death, or a birthday, or a wedding. Audible anomalies, so hearing that sound of wind or static, or the voice being hollow, something like that. 34% of people reported this. Some people reported voicemail messages, and they got recordings of them, but not very many. Haunting, so kind of relating to the tale you were telling me at the start. People had gone to a place that was known to be haunted. There was a telephone there, and people were getting strange messages on it. And people also reported having telephone calls in dreams. Now, with my PhD, I found this has increased rapidly. I've got 50 people within my study that specifically had these experiences, and I'd say that at least 10 or 12 of them have had, amongst other things, dreams of interacting with the dead. But some studies have found a study by Barrett from 1991 to 1992 in Omega Journal of Death and Dying. She did an analysis of dreams of the bereaved and found that the most popular scenario in which to interact with the dead is speaking to them on the telephone. and she found it bizarre. I found it bizarre as well. I could only say that, well, maybe if you've lost a relative that you never saw in person often, it was always telephone correspondence, the most familiar and soothing thing is to hear their voice. So in the dream we might reconstruct this telephone scenario. It doesn't really make sense though when it's a direct relative or a spouse that's died or something like that, someone you saw regularly, because visually that's the thing you want more than the auditory information. So I can't really make out why our dreams would construct those so often. There were loads of criticisms of phone calls from the dead. The most dramatic one was in the Journal of Religion and Psychical Research by Roger Anderson. He made these comments about the book Phone Calls from the Dead. These cases are not evidential, thus the researchers have no right to argue that a body of collected cases taken as a whole and analysed is a legitimate approach to spontaneous cases. It is. Since J.B. Ryan and Louisa Ryan started parapsychology in the university setting in the 1930s, Louisa Ryan collected over 10,000 spontaneous cases. That is how social sciences decides to tackle cases, spontaneous cases specifically, but if you want to do a content analysis, it's fine. You take a cluster of information on similar experiences and you see what kind of patterns are occurring, and then you can take that further if you want and conduct further analyses. It's legitimate by social science standards. So what he's talking about is complete nonsense. Patterns do not mean evidence or true findings. Remember that scale I showed you with all the varying levels? At what point did I say that was evidence that it was the dead calling? Didn't I? I just showed you what were the popular categories, and so did they. They never at one point said, well, calls from the dead, where we know they're dead, are the most popular ones, therefore it's definitely the dead. No, they're just the most popular. I don't know what that means, honestly, neither did they. It just seems to crop up. The cases do not cluster around the time of death. I don't understand how that's a criticism, but he put it forward as one. They do, as it happens, they do cluster around the time of death. It's called the crisis period. 24 hours before or after the person has died seems to be the most popular time in which to have a spontaneous event of the person that's died. But that could continue for a year afterwards, and it's been found to continue for up to 40 to 50 years afterwards. You might have lost someone 40 years later, you have a spontaneous vision of them, or a dream. It still happens. But the cluster is around death. Failure to research cases, therefore. Now I mentioned that mixed call case, that diary extract. That's all we've got. And if that's all you've got of any case, if you're in any form of social science and want to learn about a particular type of experience someone has, you could interview some people on it. If you find it's a rare experience, you could interview some and think, well, these are published accounts as well, I'll take some of those, and I'll go into books and I'll find some of those. If you want to follow them up, some of those people that wrote the original account could be dead by now. So there's no way you're going to ask them, unless by the telephone. But that's it. You have to make do. And this is where the content analysis helps, because the stronger cases help out the weaker cases. Just in telling you what appears to be going on as a whole, just like SPSS would do when you want to actually look at what's going on as a whole through questionnaires. This is kind of your qualitative route through this. So there's nothing wrong with doing that, and there's nothing wrong with not being able to research a case to its full. If you're wanting to get as big a sample size as you can, and your account is only a paragraph long, well, that's it, compared to like a 10-page account, which was like Dr. Jones's. You can still put them together, and you can still get an overall picture. Can it be explained by hallucinations, dreams, hoaxes, expectancy, and suggestion? Well, hoaxes, yeah, put that at the top of the list. Just because it's a dream doesn't mean to say it's not real. I'm sure many of you have had a dream at least once in your life, but it takes us into a massive debate as to whether the dream was real for you or not. Certainly, you'll tell me that you lived that dream and it was a very real experience for you, but just because it's a dream doesn't mean to say that it's nonsense. What if information is passed on to you that can be verified following that dream, especially from the dead? Hallucinations cannot just be put to bereavement as a conventional explanation for why people have those experiences. Suffering from separation anxiety is not a good reason to hallucinate. There has to be more cause and effect to that process. And in case of bereavement that I've looked at, or children that have had their childhood blanket taken away from them, and so forth, they don't then start hallucinating about the blanket. Fine, we might be familiar that a certain person lives with us, and when they're taken away we might assume they're still around because we're familiar with them being in the same environment. But it's a bit different when it goes beyond that and other people come into the house and experience it as well. Or it's an apparition that relays information to us. We have extra bits of information that go beyond a hallucination. Who here expects or has ever had the suggestion to have a phone call from the dead? No one. Rubbish argument then, because there's plenty of people here and it doesn't apply to any of you. So Rogo got back to him. As I said, Rogo always replied, Mr. Anderson's criticisms cannot explain the majority of cases. His possible explanations are not consistent with what is known about hallucinations and expectancy. Distorted presentation of cases. And this is James Randi's big failure, and the failure of most of the stuff you'll read about on Wikipedia regarding parapsychology. They like to put modern sceptical opinions in as final fact for the thing, and not go back to the original source of information. James Randi is a fan of putting additional information in to make things look rubbish, or as though the original research was nonsense. Roger Anderson did this in this case. He decided to say, well, here's an example that shows that Rogo and Bayliss aren't good researchers. Here's one case from their book, boy called Kyle. He has a grandmother who lives on the same street as him. She's deaf, and she's got all the numbers of his friends on the street. And whenever she wants him to come home to sort something out for her, she just picks up the phone, dials the number, and repeatedly says, Kyle, is Kyle there? I want to see Kyle. Tell him to come home. She can't hear anything, so she'll just say it and then put the phone down. That was known. She passed away. All of his friends knew about these calls. She regularly called because he'd say, Grandma, I'm going to Freddie's house. So she'd know to call Freddie if she needed him. And then repeatedly say, is Kyle there? I need Kyle. A new kid had moved in on the block 2 weeks after his grandmother had died. Kyle made friends with him, and they were in the basement discussing the idea for starting up a band. And the boy's mother came down the stairs into the basement and said, Kyle, just had a telephone call. Your grandmother was on the phone. She wouldn't respond to me though. She just kept on saying, tell Kyle to come home. Sounded quite urgent. I guess you'd better go and see if she's all right. These people knew nothing about his loss. White as a sheet, he ran out of there and went back and told his family what he'd heard. Now, that was an interesting case of Rogo and Bayliss. Roger Anderson, he said, well, of course that happened. They were pissing off the neighbours. They were down there with guitars and drums and making a loud noise, and someone who knew about Kyle's grandmother that rang up and down the street obviously rang and made that prank, and then freaked him out. At no point in the original case, even the original interview extracts, does it mention that they have any instruments. They were discussing starting a band. They didn't own any instruments. So the discussion, I'm sure, wasn't loud enough to piss off people down the street, especially if they're in the basement. So Anderson added extra information to break down the whole event. And just to finish off here, theories for the calls, we have different ones. You could say it's coincidence. You've lost a child, let's say. Mummy and Daddy, they're going to call you, very popular name, and someone calls, they say, Mum, Dad, you're in a state of grief. They realise their mistake and just put the phone down without saying sorry. For you, that's satisfaction that you've had some sort of strange, anomalous communication with the dead via the telephone. You might not even check with the call company, so that's how some calls might actually crop up being reported as phone calls from the dead. So it might lead to that misinterpretation. Hoaxers, John Randall, the late biologist and psychical researcher who was involved with our CSAPP group and passed away in 2011, he frequently told me that these were interesting cases beyond EVP. He wasn't a fan of EVP, but he said, these are certainly quite interesting. He never knew what to make of them, but he said, never ever rule out a hoax. People by their very nature can be really cruel. So even though these are terrible cases in which to create a prank, it can still happen. So I perfectly accept that, and so I've looked into these. Dreams, that goes into such a big debate. David Saunders and myself, David Saunders' PhD is on lucid dreaming. We're doing a study at the moment looking again at the actual scenarios that take place for people who dream about the dead. So we'll be presenting that sometime next year. Selective amnesia, a guy called Robert Baker in his book Hidden Voices said that in these cases of phone calls from the dead, clearly selective amnesia takes over. So you're suffering grief at home, you're wanting that final goodbye with someone, and the telephone rings, and it's a double glazing company or an insurance company or something like that wanting to speak to you, and you're on a list, but you pick up the phone, and because you're grieving, selective amnesia takes over, and you just pretend in your head that it's this person that you've lost, and they're saying, I can give you a really good offer on changing all the windows in your home. Oh yeah, it's so good to speak to you again. And you're getting that satisfaction by tricking yourself. But this has never cropped up in a case as being demonstrated. It's a theory that Robert's just applied that really hasn't been validated in any way, shape or form, and I think it'd be almost impossible to test unless you could actually capture a live telephone call from the dead happening as one of these circumstances pans out. Hallucinations, as I say, it's really hard to link just because you're in a state of bereavement to having hallucinations to these extent. I mentioned the telephone calls having slightly reduced bell tone. Well, this is where these other ideas come in. Psychokinetic involvement or paraphysical theory, they believe that maybe if you're in a state of grief, a state of stress, that separation anxiety, like with poltergeist instances, you're creating psychokinetic activity, you're influencing the environment with your mind. So is the bell tone, and the reason only one phone rings, because you're influencing the bell yourself, to actually have that will to stand up and go and answer the phone. Then when you do, you either just, like selective amnesia, pretend someone's on the line, or via the traditional senses of mediums in the seance rooms with some of the direct voices, you've created the direct voice paraphysically, an independent voice in the end. You've just created the whole call yourself, and therefore survival is ruled out. And maybe there is psychic phenomena, but there's no chance of survival of death. Everything that suggests survival of death is created through living psychic means. So there's a big kind of divide between parapsychologists who are interested in survival and those that just stick to ESP and PK. I think there's no sort of case for survival. I'm certainly in the other camp because of how much I've looked into consciousness research and the evidence for parapsychology and mind expanding beyond the body. I'm on the survival research committee for the SPR. I'm probably the youngest by 40 years. Of 7 on there, but I think there's some interesting cases now and then. Throughout all those cases I looked at, that 50, I'd say about 3 of them, 3 out of the 50, I could honestly not place any conventional explanation as to how it occurred. I'm lost for them. With the others, yeah, I could have a go at placing them, but it doesn't mean to say that's what actually happened in the original instance. But that's where we go down that line. And to finish off, I mentioned those devices. I hope you know this building. Some of you do. This is Hook and Ladder 8. This is the Ghostbusters building in New York, which I've been to many times. I know it's sad. But that's Steve Parsons with me. Steve Parsons' PhD is on infrasound, looking at low-frequency sound within environments and how it influences our body and our mind and leads to unusual experiences, particularly in haunted locations. He has a terrible likeness to Harry Price, so maybe it's some form of reincarnation of him, and he's a massive fan of Harry Price as well. But we decided to put our heads together one day, quite literally, because there was this device in the SPR office after I finished the book, which Peter Johnson, the secretary, said you might be interested in it, and it turned out to be an early telephone device that no one had ever figured out what it was for. It's donated by the Scammell family, and there it is there on the table. I was told to take it away, so I took it to Haverford West in Pembrokeshire, to where Steve lives. Steve's got a background in electronics and a master's in physics as well, so he stripped down the device. It was a really kind of old way of wiring it in. So you've got your bayonet connector for light bulbs. This was an old cable where you had to get the bayonet attachment and plug it into the light bulb fitting. So dangerous. So he rewired it so we could put it into the plug and find out what was going on. I'll give you a clearer view of what was going on the inside. So like that Melton device, it had a speaker on the lid, which is what Melton changed this for. Several vacuum tubes inside, and this box is so old it's covered in beeswax to keep it kind of dry and stop it from rotting. These get so hot when they're turned on, so we had it the wrong way around to start with, and it melted the beeswax, created smoke, we had a fire extinguisher on standby, and this was all live as well. Steve didn't realise that till he touched it and then touched the radiator and completed the circuit. But unlike me, he hasn't got any hair, so he just screamed a bit. And it was interesting. It's a broken radio. If it was a radio to work, you'd need an aerial connecting to this little thing here. The only thing that would be lighting up in a darkened seance room is this red light. You'd all be holding hands. You'd start a seance. The curtains are down. The doors are shut and so forth. And this machine goes on. And it's got 2 kind of different wave bands that cross over. As you spin this device, you can see inside the wave bands changing. If you were trying to change to a different radio station, let's say. So this was created by Ernest Valentine Scammell, who was an inventor, amateur psychical researcher in the late 1930s, early 40s, and he took this to various spiritualist churches to get in contact with the dead. His daughter was in contact with me. I think her name was Eileen Cooper, and it was after I got in touch with her, about 2 weeks after she told me everything about the device. She passed away during a routine operation. So I contacted her just in time to get all the information about this device that only she knew about. So that was so fortunate, but so tragic at the same time. So, what happened when we fired this up? Instantly, it creates this vum, 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 vum noise. And if you're in a closed, darkened room, it's really interesting. You're hearing these sounds and they're vibrating off the walls. They will bounce like ripples in a bath. They'll go to the wall and back to you again. The people that were in the room when we first fired it up instantly started to get headaches and felt sick. If you listen to it for more than 10 minutes, it creates a tinnitus effect in the ears, which again is kind of like a group suggestion and pareidolia effect, because the tinnitus sounds like it's external in this case. And so you can get, did you hear the name Joan? I think I heard Joan. Yeah, I heard Joan. In a darkened room with a suggestion, you're getting in touch with the spirits with this loud device going, and it really is quite intimidating when it's on. It really kind of brings home the suggestion that someone's getting in touch. from what we could tell from the mechanics and the psychology, no clear voice was coming through ever. It's not a radio that works, it's just different pitches coming through the speaker. And that's all you're getting, different forms of static. So as far as we're concerned, it's got conventional explanations for why it was producing effect. But again, without Ernest Valentine's Scammell, without any notes, without seeing how it was originally set up and used, we really couldn't tell you if that's the absolute truth behind the device and how it worked. Following that, we decided to publish about this in Paracoustics, the latest anthology based on Steve's idea, which is a big anthology based on all research in the paranormal surrounding sound. So physics of sound, psychology of sound, in which it discusses the Scammell device, brief history of EVP, psychology of EVP, telephone anomalies, in which I've written more about them, and more cases like that 1889 case I mentioned but never talked about. Shamanic use of drumming and music in spirit possession by Jack Hunter from the University of Bristol. Dr Barry Colvin on anomalous poltergeist raps, where his study showed that when going to a place that has poltergeist activity and recording the sound of poltergeist raps, they don't match the acoustical properties of the building in it cracking and creaking and moving, or even simulator ones by us knocking. They seem to have separate acoustical properties, which seem to suggest they're anomalously produced or processed. Also Mel Willing, he's an expert in music, he's just finishing his third PhD at the moment. He has talked about music and death and how people around the deathbed have heard music. And Clay Foley, who's an ex-forensic criminal investigator, has talked about those spontaneous voices of music in a whole chapter. Many chapters and about 8 appendices on how to go and record EVPs properly for yourself and detect infrasound in haunted locations. Massive references and stuff. But beyond this, I am planning to collect more phone calls from the dead. I am planning to do further analyses to publish in peer-reviewed journals, because already my file has probably got at least 15 more cases beyond the book, and more kind of bits of research papers that need adding in. It keeps going, as you know. Research just keeps going and going. So that's it. Thank you very much.